Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 9 transfer plans. Game Week 8 is still not over yet. We still have one game to play, which is going to be West Ham versus Brentford at home. So I'm really looking forward to that because I still have a player to play. I'm currently sitting on 80 points. I'm recording this video for Game Week 8. Still knowing that Bruno is going to get triple bonus points as he did within that match versus Liverpool. Very happy that I held on to Bruno and that he, for example, I don't know, let's say even outscored someone like Saka this week. Although I could have obviously brought in another forward who maybe would have produced something, but unlikely that I was going to do that. I'm very happy that I Bruno my team. And now, one game week on, I'm looking at my team and I think let's just address the problem points first because we actually have done quite well. I think Lacroix is a problem point and I'll talk about that in a moment. Reinders, another one, Gyökeres, not a problem point, but I think annoying, right? And then when I look at the rest of my team, I think that Anderson injury timeline is going to be a little bit of something to think about just in terms of how am I going to set my defense up in the future, even though I would say the other four defenders that I have right now are very good in terms of playing week on week, right? Like, I won't feel too bad about having Virgil, who's very good at DEFCON still, having Gabriel, having Senesi, and even Lacroix, as I said, is a problem, but not someone who needs a lot of work to kind of improve. The main thing is this week I do want to make some impactful moves, and I feel like one way to do that is by going quite aggressive with my transfers. This is the first time I think over the last 2 seasons I've actually racked up three transfers. And I'm pretty happy that I actually did that because, yeah, I think I dislike my team a little bit more than I did last week. And that's okay sometimes. Like, even within a good game week, you can find that you have a few players that actually really annoy you. And I still haven't watched Paqueta play. So I think the key thing in terms of making transfers, even today, if I'm to go early, is really to just think about, okay, if I look at someone like Paqueta in my team, is he going to be a problem and do I leave room for a potential transfer out? Because as we discussed previously with Paqueta's fixtures, he's not really going to be a sell, right? With games like this, you'd ideally want to sell him after Burnley at home, not before. But if I have to sell him, then I will. And that just probably comes down to maybe an evaluation of the West Ham team strength, that sort of thing. But he's a very safe and comfortable hold, whereas Reinders is not. And Reinders actually, on the flip side, has some of the worst fixtures in hand. And in Game Week 13, we can reassess with this Man City team. We should have enough free transfers by then rolled up to actually move into them. When I look at, for example, the overall landscape as well, even though these Liverpool games are nice, other than maybe Gakpo, I don't really see the need to go towards Salah. I'm not going to make that bet on Salah in Game Week 12 either. We're starting to see some of the minutes within the league are not the best, and I think that's a big indictment in terms of where we're at right now with regards to Mo Salah and how important he is within the FPL landscape. So there's that. But yeah, I feel pretty happy about my team. In terms of how I've tripled up on Arsenal, I wanted to start from that. It doesn't feel perfect every week, sort of seeing other players outscore Raya, but he's very consistent. I still think that I have strong players in other positions. And I think sometimes you have to think about, within the case with Arsenal, and why I kind of like double Arsenal defense and one outfield player, is that we're actually generally struggling to find midfielders that we like. We're also struggling to find forwards that we like. So if we just like Arsenal as a team, I don't feel too bad about, let's say, owning maybe a Saka within the midfield in the future over, let's say, someone like Gyökeres, and then still maintaining double Arsenal defense. There have been enough defenders for us that we find are still very, very good. Like even some of the 4.0 defenders that I've been sort of continuously touting within the cheat sheet and have done really, really well, here and there, because of course you're not expecting clean sheets at the rate of Arsenal, but you're still expecting things like DEFCON a little bit higher within certain other teams. And then at the same time, you can still get these monstrous hauls, Gabriel is probably not going to get some sort of monstrous haul like Mukiele did. But that's sometimes just the lay of the land, right? It's going to be hard to sort of pick the right player who's going to get that 18 point haul. That's not really the point. You can just find players who can consistently get you those 5 to 6 points. And even someone like Munoz is a good example of that, where he's a very good FPL pick. I don't own him. I'd love to own him in FPL, but I'm still doing, I think, generally quite okay without him. But maybe I need to keep my mind open in terms of how to bring him into my team, because he's actually one of the defenders that I don't have in my team that I'm really excited to hopefully try and own. And equally, Sar within the midfield, who didn't do anything within this match versus Bournemouth, but is also someone that I find really electric. And I'll be honest, I think after Mateta's great performance and just looking at his numbers this season and potentially putting one of the best performances that I've seen within a single match in terms of the amount of chances that he actually got with 3.48 XG versus Bournemouth, I mean, there's not much to be said other than I feel quite comfortable owning Mateta. And that's sometimes what happens in FPL. Like your thoughts change very quickly, because I think I've spoken to other Mateta owners themselves, and some of them have actually recently transferred out of Mateta, and I kind of understand that, because you're watching a player who's missing chances. Like, the narrative can go very easily two ways. You can either take the path of saying, this is a Dominic Calvert-Lewin, he's missing chances, I don't like him, or he's actually getting a lot of chances, I'd like to keep him, at least on the basis that he has good minutes. And I think the key thing with Mateta is knowing that it can ebb and flow within. He can be a 70-minute substitution, especially since Europe is, already here. But in circumstances where, let's say, Crystal Palace are chasing a game, or, for example, the game is in balance, like the Liverpool match, for example, where they were drawing at one point, I think Mateta can stay on and play 90 minutes. And probably I was feeling that Mateta's minutes could be quite low after reacting towards the Everton game. But as an owner, I'm a little bit biased, because you kind of watch your player frustrate you, and that kind of tilts that logic. But I was never going to sell Mateta this week, and almost by having such a great performance this week, it almost makes me feel like I just have to keep him, right? This I mean, that's not really a question. Same with Semenyo, who's just really consistent. Bruno, as we said, getting 8 points versus Liverpool, I think, is massive. He just has a pretty impeccable fixture run coming up, right? When we look at these games, I mean, we're talking about Brighton here, Nottingham Forest, Tottenham away, probably being the tough match alongside Crystal Palace away, but every other match here is pretty much splendid. Like, most of the away games are actually good, or in terms of good teams to play versus, and then the home matches are just better home games, right? With Paqueta, as I said, I want to watch him on Monday and sort of see whether he needs a transfer. I think within the midfield landscape, I mean, the players that I'm targeting loosely would be players like Enzo, even Njai, not necessarily Kudus, but probably even someone like Ismail Assar. And 2 out of 3 of those players will obviously be going towards AFCON. Kudus is the one that isn't, but I'm not looking at him. Minte, however, is also another player that I'm roughly looking at, but it doesn't seem like Man United away at Old Trafford is exactly a great jump spot to sort of move into Minte. So I'll talk in a moment about my transfer plans there. With Lacroix, I think what annoys me the most about him is he is 5.1 million. So I have a little bit of leeway to sort of keep him and keep a price drop. But the main thing right now is as I did within my What We've Learned video, Chris Richards is actually outscoring him in DEFCON rate, and he just did that within the previous match as well, actually hitting DEFCON, whereas Lacroix only got 8. At the same time, I'm watching these matches, and Guehi's literally getting onto every single set piece, even in international play. I don't know what's going on with Mark Guehi this season, but he's just getting onto every single set piece chance. Like, when I think about Lacroix's best chance so far this season from a set piece versus West Ham, where he hits the crossbar, that was going to be a Guehi assist too. So, that's annoying. And then of course we know the value of Munoz in open play, so that's not even within dispute. But Lacroix not even getting enough DEFCON to sort of supersede that for now, at least given the price that he's at. Whereas obviously if I own Richards and I didn't own Munoz, I don't think I'd feel so hard done, because the gap isn't so short. But that's how things fall sometimes. I think, you kind of readjust your opinions on players as the season goes on. If you looked at last season's DEFCON rate, I think that was a reason why I owned Lacroix on my Game Week 4 wildcard. But now, a couple of game weeks into this season and looking at the numbers so far, there's clearly no justification for the separation in price. And sometimes that happens. With Reinders, the minutes are just too bad. So for me, he's the biggest problem point in my team. Regardless of whatever I do this week, he's going to go out on my team. Liverpool don't look great, and Virgil himself honestly doesn't look great, but I don't think that's, I don't think Virgil's minutes are in danger, if we want to put it like that. Anderson's a soft problem in terms of, I don't know how long this hamstring injury is going to be, but there is an international break, so I'm hoping that he'll be fit at least by the end of the next one, which means that if we're talking about Anderson, I think the tricky thing is we might really miss 2 amazing games, right? Wolves at home and Everton away. Now, Everton away doesn't necessarily look like a great game, but I feel like if he actually can survive through the international break from game week 11 to 12 here, I would very much like to keep someone like Anderson in my team for games like Sunderland at home, Crystal Palace at home, Burnley away, and then there's actually much better games later down the line. So he, for me, is still going to be a season-long keeper as long as he's reasonably fit, right? If of course there's something much more serious with the injury, then we can react to that. But I quite like keeping Anderson in the team, and part of the reason why I've gone so deep within my defenses is for circumstances like this. But that's going to be my sort of evaluation of my team. In terms of actually how I felt about this weekend and the football that we saw, I think Forest and Chelsea was a game of 2 halves. Everyone who watched that game knew that, but I think we all appreciated that once we saw the Chelsea team sheet. I mean, that was a pretty despicable team for Chelsea. They didn't have Caicedo. Enzo wasn't in the part of the squad. Yeah, there's not much to really be said there. I think with the João Pedro context, do I still think he has some value in the game? Absolutely. But do I understand the frustration that people have owning João Pedro? And I think is it almost like the opposite situation with Mateta, where it's like, this is someone who's guaranteed to get minutes almost, but isn't getting shots, isn't getting chances. I think it's very much like that, but actually he still has really, really good fixtures, and I think inevitably you're going to get goals, right? It's like, if I was to think about who actually scored those goals for Chelsea that match. I mean, I don't think many people were actually expecting these to be the goal scorers. So going forward, it just suggests that João Pedro is always going to have a small piece of that pie. It doesn't mean that he's going to have a huge part of that pie like a Haaland, like a Mateta. But that's just something to mention, right? So I wouldn't feel too bad about João Pedro, but I can understand why people are hurt about it. It's nice that they got a clean sheet as well, but I think it was also quite a fortunate clean sheet. With Brighton and Newcastle, this was a game that I expected to go Brighton's favor. I know a lot of people are super pro Newcastle, but at the end of the day, this is an away game. And I think people just need to value sometimes what happens when you actually have a really tough game in hand. When you are a really top defense like a Newcastle is, it doesn't mean that you're impervious to much or top half teams like a Brighton, especially when they're at home and they have the opportunity to hurt you. So there's not much really to be said. I think the takeaway from that game is, once again, Waltemad is just absolutely crazy. Gordon had an early substitution in this match, so I think, my thoughts on Gordon, I feel justified in terms of dropping him within the cheat sheet. Regarding Waltemad again, just the XG so far has been super promising. The finishing is something that looks great. I mean, he's got a lot of flair, to be honest, for a player, I guess, of his size, of his stature. But yeah, I mean, he continues to fire. But I think the crucial thing for me is, as I said, looking at the XG, that it's very promising. It's better than someone like Gyökeres is. And I think that's why, as an owner of someone like Gyökeres, I am quite frustrated, because you have some other picks in the game that are doing a lot more. It's nice that I have one out of the two picks that I think a lot of people are looking to buy in terms of, what strikers we're trying to pick up in the future. So I might not own Waltemad, but I think he looks excellent. With Welbeck, I think he's a bit of a troll, and I still think the issue always is going to be Fabian Hürzeler and him never really giving you information. For example, if Welbeck was going to miss a match or if he was injured, I don't think Fabian Hürzeler ever tells you this information within the press. We only really ever know about injuries if a player gets hurt within a match. And Welbeck is also an extremely old player as well, so you kind of run the risk of someone who's actually very injury prone over the course of his career just doing exactly that, getting injured. With Burnley and Leeds, I think Leeds probably, they conceded to a banger, and I think Leeds are still quite poor from the attacking point of view. So I'm sure a lot of people will sort of say that's okay. That's in conflation with you saying that DCL is a good pick, and to be fair, I think all I'm saying is that Leeds are a relatively poor attack, but I'd still think that most of the chances fall towards someone like DCL. Now, I think he had something like 0.33 XG within that match, which is not very high considering it's a pretty high quality game for him. You expect him to kind of have some really good numbers in that game, but he's had better numbers within previous games. So I don't think there's much need to overact with DCL, but it just shows you that this Leeds team is still pretty fragile. And I think it's unfortunate that they conceded goals, right? I think anyone who actually was playing Leeds players, Burnley players, Sunderland players, it all made a lot of sense this week to play these types of players, especially even ahead of players like Senesi. So if, for example, like you're someone who played a Leeds player over Senesi, I don't think you can feel hard done by that at all. And on the flip side, of course, you can feel super happy about that if you own a Burnley player or a Sunderland player. Wolves were very, very, very poor. And I think Sunderland, once again, super impressive in terms of defense. And I think in a quite sort of low chance creating game from both teams, they've managed to score 2 goals, similar to Burnley. There's not too much, I would say, to really evaluate on this other than to say we just have some really good 4.0 picks in the game. And it's still hard for me to choose strikers within these teams if they're more expensive than that sort of 5.5 benchmark for DCL. Like I think with Strand Larsen, you're asking for a lot really for him to sort of outperform the kind of price that he's at. And I think that's the tricky thing in terms of the team strength piece. We can arguably say the same thing for Wolves and Nottingham Forest, so I'd like to monitor that situation going forwards. We know Nottingham Forest obviously have a new manager. I didn't really even talk about within the Chelsea piece. That's obviously very unfortunate for Ange, but that is what it is. With Crystal Palace and Bournemouth, I think Crystal Palace actually created much more chances versus Bournemouth, but of course in terms of game state, Bournemouth led the game very easily and comfortably for a bit. I still think Krupi's very interesting, so that's the only thing I'll probably say coming out of that game that's changed my mind. I've talked about the Crystal Palace defense already, but Krupi Jr. with Evan Nilsson potentially being out for a few weeks with a soleus injury is interesting. I did a very quick ChatGPT informal search of what the timeline could be. I think we're talking maybe minimum 3 weeks out potentially, but we don't know exactly when he sustained this injury, because if he sustained it a couple of weeks ago, he could be back very, very quickly. And of course, the grade of the injury will determine how long it takes for him to come back to football. I will remind you that I think one of the tricky things with dealing with Iraola within press conferences is that he has almost been, I wouldn't say I just think he just hasn't been super faithful, or his words aren't super clear. Like last season, we had Kluivert who was touch and go, and he ended up being out for I think 3-4 weeks of football, maybe even 5. With Evan Nilsson, I think he had a bone injury and he was coming back. And then he said Evan Nilsson still had a couple, weeks or even months out. And I think Evan Nilsson almost came back the week after that. So that for me is is a bit of bait, but I think, you know, if we can trust Irola, there's an interesting transfer there for a lot of people who own someone like Krupi Jr. For example, for the people who own, let's say, 3 strikers now, and you want to move into a 3-5-2 setup / 4-4-2 hybrid, Krupi Jr. is going to be that player, because some people are already creating teams that, you know, include a Marshall, include an Obi, include a Gu. There's nothing wrong now with owning someone like Krupi Jr., especially if you need someone who actually just plays for this week and this week alone, where he's got Nottingham Forest at home. With City and Everton, I think my main takeaway within this game is NJI was absolutely fantastic, but I think the second takeaway is that the City team has changed in a sense where I feel like the importance of the players from a goal scoring perspective that aren't Haaland has dropped, right? Like I just don't see Foden as that sort of talismanic player who is getting 3 shots per game like he did in his player of the season game. I think he's averaging the least amount of shots he's ever had per game now, and that's not impressive. Whereas with Haaland, I think he's just going strength to strength. So there's not much really to be said. The City defense still actually looks really comfortably solid, but I think now the issue that we're seeing is that with a little bit more depth in the team, you're starting to see a bit more rotation. Even Guardiola, who maybe has something muscular, I'm not sure exactly what's going on, or some sort of load management is happening, but City do have that sort of depth now to kind of hurt you from that perspective. With Fulham versus Arsenal, I think the Arsenal attack still looks quite dry, but I think the positive is if you own players like Rice and you own players like Saka, you're still going to get a piece of that set piece pie. I don't feel like I get that from Gyökeres, so it's frustrating, but it feels like maybe he could get the next penalty. But we also know that penalties this season aren't that important. And looking at someone like Saka and seeing the performance that he put in, getting DEFCON, getting bonus, which is not a surprise. I think because of the sort of staleness of the game and the amount of chances he created himself, it made sense that he got bonus. I'm not salty about that. I think it's just more about thinking that it is a bit of a side grade still, but actually I would still very much like to be in the camp of owning Saka and Gyökeres. So if I have the luxury to do it, I think my plan, generally speaking, is to move towards Saka as soon as possible. With Spurs versus Villa, I feel like something that we took away from the What We've Learned series is that I don't think Spurs have actually improved that much under Thomas Frank, and I think Aston Villa scored 2 screamers, to be honest, like in terms of like what the quality of the goals were. It's not like they completely destroyed the Spurs defense, but we've always said that the Spurs team has almost tilted where they're becoming a lot more defensively dominant, but then the attack is very stale. And I still feel like watching them play with Xavi Simons, who just doesn't look like he's fully there yet. Richarlison, who's a bit of a periphery player now, even Tell getting 60 minutes, and then I think he had ice on his legs. Kolomwani as a sub, even Brennan Johnson's coming in, then moving into back 3. I'm just not super convinced really on the attack, and that's kind of why I'm not super interested in a team like Spurs, because I think the fixture run gets worse. With Liverpool versus United, I think Liverpool actually resembled Liverpool of old in terms of the second half, in terms of how many chances they created, how much they can kind of overwhelm the team. But this time I think United kind of didn't take their chances in the first half, where they were quite clearly dominant, and probably that was quite a one-sided game. And then Liverpool equally didn't take their chances in the second half. So I think it was a game of 2 halves once again. But on balance, I feel like just because of the sort of chances in the first half and the way that United controlled the game for the most part, I feel like it was still quite deserved. But I'm sure a lot of people can look at the XG with Liverpool and just say that that was very unfortunate. And of course, Gakpo hit the post 3 times, not to mention he missed a sitter plus scored a virtual tap-in. So hard to say. I guess Liverpool will feel pretty hard done by that. But there's a bit of a game state element. And I think the impressive thing is that United are able to, I guess, grit down into some games and actually get some results. But for the most part, they've been a very, very good team at home, terrible away. And this is a nice performance for United. With West Ham versus Brentford, that's remaining to be seen. But as we talked about in terms of setting up this game with context, I think this is very much a bottom half game. So let's just see what happens and react to that. All right, quickly, let's jump into my transfer plans. So we're back here with the My Team pick and rating tool. This is my team as it stands in terms of Game Week 9. Obviously, we're looking ahead towards Game Week 10 now and thinking about how we're going to improve the team going forwards. This is, as I said, something you can access as a pro user of Fantasy Football Hub. They have a 50% offer right now. So if you look at the link in the description below, you'll easily be able to access this discount and make use of tools like this alongside things like suggested transfers, expected points, and even the Opta stats tool, which I use a lot, specifically to kind of monitor DEFCON and the underlying stats of players. So in terms of optimizing this team for this week, I think clearly it's just suggesting, I'm in Game Week 9. I don't know why I did that, but yeah, we're in Game Week 9. I think the team is in a pretty poor state. Mateta feels nice to play versus Arsenal, but I really don't want to do that because I'm almost going to back double Arsenal here and hope for the best. I really want to get Reinders out of my team. I kind of want to get Gyökeres out of my team. Now, what I'm going to do with this video is I'm going to suggest 2 different types of transfer plans. So the first transfer plan is the more aggressive transfer plan, and something that I'm probably going to lean towards doing right now. So this is going to be, I think, going Krupi, hoping that he plays, playing him versus Nottingham Forest at home, going out of Reinders and going into Saka. Now, doing these moves actually leaves me 1 million in the bank. Now, what does 1 million bank do for me? 1 million in the bank does a lot because 1 million in the bank can get me from Dewsbury Hall to Minte. It can get me from Paqueta to Enzo. So I feel like what I'm going to do this week is most likely lock in the double move of moving out of Gyökeres into Saka, moving out of Reinders into Saka, that is, and then moving Gyökeres into Krupi. And then obviously, I think the play for me is to maybe just play Mateta and Krupi, or maybe play Krupi and Dewsbury Hall. Now, I'm not super fussed on who I actually play between the three of these players. I just think that these are the worst players on my team. 2 out of 3 will do. I can't really say much else for them, right? So maybe I just bench Dewsbury Hall in this case and I play Krupi, hoping that Evan Nilsson's just going to be out for a long time, that Krupi Jr. can play something like the 75 minutes he actually played versus Crystal Palace. I think the one thing that people are sort of neglecting as well with Evan Nilsson being out is that Krupi was still actually substituted within that game, despite them not having a striker, and he was subbed off for Amin Adli. So it might be the case that if Krupi plays a slightly worse game, that he could be subbed off a little bit earlier. So I feel like no one should be jumping into Krupi Jr. thinking that he's going to be a consistent nailed option. And me going into Krupi Jr. is actually going to probably put my team in a little bit of a worse state, because I'm actually going from, you know, players like, let's say, or a 3-4-3 setup where I think that Dewsbury Hall was basically my 8th attacker, to now saying that I've got Dewsbury Hall and Krupi Jr. And so I'm quite reliant on actually having a strong team at the back. But I don't have that strong team at the back this week. So therefore, Krupi becomes someone that I play this week. And hopefully, you know, my team can kind of manage the situation going forward. So if I go and look at Gameweek 10, for example, it actually requires me to play Anderson. Now, Dewsbury Hall is something that I totally feel comfortable playing over Anderson next week. So, you know, it could still just be a 3-5-2 that's very, very strong. And this Paqueta pick could be Enzo. This Dewsbury Hall pick could be Minte as well, right? So if I bring Minte into the team, that's obviously a very different dynamic. I would probably actually allow myself to bench Anderson game week 10. So that's something I'm thinking about. Whereas obviously if I go for the Enzo sort of transfer route, I think that leaves me with having to play Dewsbury Hall versus Sunderland, which is a little bit worse in terms of compared to Anderson. Whereas with the Minte situation, I would have someone who's much better than Anderson this week. So that's something I've been thinking about in terms of monitoring Enzo. And if I go back to Game Week 9, the key thing as to if I do Paqueta to Enzo is, and you can see it's suggested here, or even someone like Njai, is I just need the confidence that these players are going to be, you know, fit and ready to play, right? I need Enzo to play versus Sunderland at home. And if he's not ready to play versus Sunderland at home, then I'm going to just go Minte from Dewsbury Hall. But there could also be a chance where maybe I just roll, right? I don't think this is the worst team in the world, playing Dewsbury Hall, for example, playing Mateta, or even playing Krupi. So if I go towards Game Week 10, I think that the one option that I do give myself is I can still maybe do Paqueta out for Sarr on a week like this, right? If I go for Sarr, I actually then triple up on Crystal Palace. It's not exactly the triple up that I really want. I'm priced out of Munoz, of course, who's continuing to sort of rise in price, and I think a lot of people are appreciating his value. But that's probably the one sort of sad thing. But I will have another free transfer to maybe even like cutting down Lacroix this week, or even maybe something like if we know Anderson's out for a long time and I actually really want to have, let's say, double Palace, maybe what I could do is still Anderson to Richards. And then I have another midfield transfer possible, right? So I can still go for someone like maybe a Minte in this situation for maybe a Dewsbury Hall instead. So if I was to do something like that, I don't think this is the worst move possible. So maybe it's a double move this week. And actually, I've got a pretty strong team if I move in Minte and Richard. So you can kind of see there's quite a bit of value. And I think the sad thing looking at the Fantasy Football Hub model too is that they've kind of already baked in how much better Richards so far has been at CBIT, and how Lacroix is actually the worst player despite being the more expensive one. This is not exactly the team that I think is the best, but I think it's a good team, right? If Enzo, for example, is very flimsy, I think having a Minte based team with Mateta, with even someone like Paqueta, who I can move on later down the line, as I said, after Game Week 11, I think that works out really well. So if we look at Game Week 11, Paqueta is just a wonderful pick in this week. And actually having double Palace defense, like, it can't really go wrong within my team. And I don't really want to play Senesi versus Aston Villa or Virgil versus Man City. So that can be quite interesting too. And that's generally the more aggressive transfer path that I'm thinking about. The second transfer path that I'm thinking about is actually something that's extremely cautious, right? So something that allows me to accumulate 3-3 transfers for next week, and is just a very simple transfer. It's going to be Reinders to Minte. Now, the reason why this could be quite helpful for my team is if I'm a little bit, let's say, unsure on maybe waiting for European fixtures, if I wanted to be a bit more passive with my approach and maybe not be super reliant on someone like Krupi Jr., for example, for the short term, and even having Dewsbury Hall within my team, this can actually work out quite nicely where I just have a squad that looks like this. And I still enjoy, I guess, Gyökeres, who should be able to kind of beat some of these easier teams like game week 9, 10, 11. I think are still very nice for Gyökeres because we think that Havertz is actually to come back after the Sunderland away game. So in terms of timelines, like I think Gyökeres has a pretty good timeline horizon where you can play him for these 3 games and then you can just sell him before Spurs at home because the international break is between 11 and 12. So if Havertz is to come back and he's going to play minutes, for example, on 12, then of course you want to be rid of Gyökeres by 12, which means that for 12, that's where I sort of prepare my Saka like switch a little bit later down the line. And I think it's quite convenient because, of course, Paqueta would be a problem, right? Whereas Dewsbury Hall for now isn't going to create a problem because I have a team that's still reasonably speaking quite strong for this week. If I go towards game week 10, I think I'd probably keep the team exactly in the same place because without needing to sort of move towards Saka at any point in time, I think I can persist with the squad. As you can see, Anderson wouldn't be a play here in game week 10. In game week 11, I'm probably a little bit more reliant on Anderson, but I think, if I have to play, as I said, Senesi worst case scenario, or if I just consider once again another Chris Richards type transfer, there is that opportunity there. Unfortunately, with this sort of Paqueta team structure, I can't really easily go towards Ismaila Sarr, so that kind of closes off the opportunity for me to go for someone like Sarr on a week like this, or even someone like Enzo, right? So that's something to think about too, and it's almost why I want to go a little bit more aggressive, because by moving, I guess, one of the problem midfielders I have in my team from Reinders into Saka, the value of that is that I actually don't have to think about some of the midfielders that annoy me. Neither do I have to think about Gyökeres, who also annoys me. And then Minte would also cover another spot in my team that I feel like I could probably just use and I wouldn't feel bad about, because at 6 million, I think he's just really, really reasonably priced. So that's something I'm thinking about. And then obviously on game week 12, as I said, this is the week where we probably think about bidding off Gyökeres. And maybe it's as simple as someone into Gu and then Paqueta towards Saka. Now, the issue with this, of course, is that I'll still need to sort of see what's up within the FPL landscape. I'll still need to see whether maybe this is an opportunity for me to just move off with someone like Lacroix as well. So I think the nice thing for my team is that I don't necessarily need to be super aggressive with my team, but it can use a little bit of work. And if we go all the way back towards game week 9, as I said, transfers in the future will definitely stem around Lacroix, around Gyökeres, around what was previously, of course, I can't even remember now who's in this team. Reinders, obviously, who's for me the pain point and has to go. So whatever I do this week will be around Reinders. I think the aggressive play is just to make the move towards Saka. I think from a price momentum point of view, we sometimes tend to think about this. Like I'm the type of FPL content creator who likes doing early transfers, because I do think that if you weigh up over the course of the season, making a lot of early transfers that get you price rises, I think you get knock-on impacts in terms of price rises. And even though you might get hurt by things like injuries and etc., and that can actually be really bad for your team, I'm also the type of manager that doesn't feel bad about that, because once you've made a decision to sort of commit yourself towards getting price rises and to try sort of improve your team for the long term from that perspective, then if I have to resuscitate my team with a -4, I will do so very, very comfortably. So something to think about for someone who is a bit more aggressive, something to think about for someone who's a bit more passive. But that's going to be my Game Week 9 transfer plans. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.